Today we have a really cool video for you guys. It'll be a collection of 4 stories that are all fan favorites, and they all share a theme: Appalachian Mountains Horror Stories, Story 1. The last thing Daniel remembered before the sun came up was that whatever had been standing 3 feet from him for 2 hours hadn't moved once. Here's how he got there. Daniel left on a Thursday in late October. That part I know because I drove him to the trailhead myself. He had his pack already broken in. Nothing new, nothing untested. He'd done sections of the AT before, knew the rhythm of it, knew how to read weather in the tree line. He was 29 years old and in the kind of shape that makes you feel like nothing in the woods can touch you. He told me he'd be back in 11 days, summit a few peaks, sleep under canvas, decompress from a job he hated. Simple set. He was back in 4. I want to be careful about how I describe the version of my brother that came back, because I don't want to sound like I'm dramatizing. I'm not. I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes and what I've been trying to explain to people for the last 2 years, who mostly nod and say nothing. He was thinner. Not hiker thin, not the kind of weight loss that comes from burning calories over terrain. This was different. His face had dropped in a way that faces don't drop in 4 days. His eyes, and I still think about this, his eyes had moved. Not literally, but the way he held them. The angle, like they were tracking something slightly above and to the right of wherever you were standing. Even when he looked directly at you, there was this, a quarter second where the eyes arrived after the head had already turned. He smelled wrong. Not unwashed, not trail grimy, something else. Something I couldn't place, like a combination of soil and something metallic and something organic I didn't have a word for. He came up the driveway at 4:47 in the morning. I know because I saw the time on my phone when the motion light woke me up. I looked out the window and there he was, standing at the edge of the drive where the concrete meets the grass, just standing, not moving toward the door, not raising his hand to knock, just standing with his pack still on, looking at the house. I went down and let him in. He didn't say anything for a long time. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Then he said, "Something followed me." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I don't know what it was, but it followed me for 2 nights. The second night I could hear it breathing outside the tent." I asked if it was a bear. He looked at me then. That lag again, the eyes arriving a moment late. It wasn't a bear, he said. It stood up. He didn't sleep that first night. I checked on him twice, and both times he was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands in his lap, facing the window, not looking out, just facing it. He told me the story in pieces over the next few days, sometimes backing up, sometimes skipping forward, the way people tell stories that they haven't yet figured out how to begin. He'd been 3 days out from Springer Mountain, pushing north through Georgia into the first fingers of North Carolina. He'd planned to camp at a designated site, but had made better time than expected and pushed past it by about 2 miles before making camp in a hollow just off the trail out of the wind. He said the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of the deep woods at night, which any experienced hiker knows isn't really silence at all. It's insects and small animals and the settlement of trees. This was the other kind. The kind where everything stops at once like a switch being thrown. He unzipped his tent and looked out. Nothing. He told himself it was a deer. He told himself it was weather coming. He said this once, decided he believed it, and zipped the tent back up. Fell asleep faster than he expected to. The second night was 40 miles further north. He woke up at 2 a.m. and knew immediately he wasn't alone outside the tent. He said it wasn't any single thing he could point to. Not a sound, not a smell, nothing he could describe cleanly. Just a pressure. Like the air just outside the tent fabric had changed density. He lay still for a long time, then he heard it breathe. One breath. Slow, controlled, nasal. Not an animal breath, or not a 4-legged animal breath. He said it was the rhythm of it that got him. Too measured, too patient. He didn't move, he didn't make a sound. He lay on his back with his eyes open and listened to whatever was outside his tent breathe slowly and deliberately in the dark. It was still there when the sky began to lighten. He unzipped the tent fast and came out ready to run. Nothing there. But the ground immediately outside the tent, 3 feet from where he'd been lying, had been compressed. Not crushed, not clawed, just pressed down evenly across a roughly person-shaped area, like something had crouched there and held that position for hours. He packed in under 4 minutes and walked out. He didn't stop walking until he reached a road. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand that the thing that disturbed me was not the story. The story was frightening, yes, but I could have explained it a dozen ways. An animal, exhaustion, fear-creating sound where there was none. What disturbed me was what happened on the third night he was home. I woke at 3 a.m. to my motion sensor light. I went to the window. Daniel was standing in the driveway. Same position as when he'd come home, hands at his sides. Facing the tree line at the edge of my property, where the yard drops off into about 40 yards of scrub and then the county road. He stood there for 2 hours. I watched. I didn't go down. I don't know why. I just watched. At 5:15, he turned and came inside. He walked up the stairs, went to his room, and closed the door. The next morning, I checked the yard. In the scrub at the property line, pressed into the soft ground where the water collects, there were tracks. Bipedal, evenly spaced. Deeper at the toe, they went to the tree line. They stopped there. Nothing came in. But something had stood at the edge of my yard and looked at my house for 2 hours while my brother stood in the driveway and looked back. Daniel went home a week later. He seems fine now. He talks normally, eats normally, sleeps, as far as I know, like a person sleeps. He doesn't talk about the trail. When I bring it up, he changes the subject in a way that feels automatic, like he's been doing it long enough that it no longer requires effort. He hasn't hiked since. Last month, I drove past the trailhead where I dropped him off. I don't know why I stopped. I pulled over and got out and stood there for a minute looking at where the path enters the trees. There was a man standing just inside the tree line, about 30 feet in, just standing, facing out. By the time I blinked, he was gone. I don't hike the AT. I've never had a reason to until recently. I tell myself it was just a hiker resting in the shade. I tell myself that once. And I drive home fast and I don't look in the rearview mirror because I don't want to see the tree line moving when there's no wind. Whatever found my brother on that trail, I don't think it came back with him. I think it came back ahead of him, and I think it's been waiting to see if the rest of us are worth following, too. If you made it to the end of this, subscribe. There are more stories coming. This one is just where it starts. Story 2. The last thing Marcus Hale saw before the cold hit him was a shape at the tree line that was too tall, too thin, and holding perfectly still, and then his headlamp battery died, and everything was black. Here's how he got there. The case that changed everything for Special Agent Renata Collier was never officially closed. She'll tell you that herself, now that she's retired. She spent 18 years in the FBI's Violent Crime Unit and worked 241 homicides. She can close her eyes and tell you the case number, victim name, and primary evidence item for every one of them. She doesn't have to close her eyes for case 7-2009 ATGA. That one stays open whether she wants it to or not. They found the body of Marcus Hale on April 14th, 2009, 3/10 of a mile off the Appalachian Trail in Rabun County, Georgia. He was 26. Former Army, ran ultramarathons for fun. The kind of man who doesn't panic. He was found in a crouching position, back against a tree, both knees drawn up. His hands were still wrapped around the straps of his pack. His head was tilted back at roughly a 40-degree angle, like he'd been looking up at something above him when he died. There were no wounds on the front of his body. The back was different. Collier doesn't go into specifics in interviews. She just says, whatever made those marks, it wasn't any implement in any database she's ever had access to. Not a tool, not an animal. Something in between, or something that didn't fall into either category. Cause of death was listed officially as exposure, complicated by acute psychological stress, which is the bureaucratic way of saying, we found a perfectly healthy 26-year-old former soldier dead in the Georgia woods, and we don't entirely know why his heart stopped. His headlamp was found 12 feet from his body, battery dead. Batteries tested fine, no malfunction, no manufacturing defect. They had simply run out. A fresh set installed 4 days earlier by Hale himself completely drained. Estimated time of death, somewhere between midnight and 4 a.m. The temperature that night had dropped to 31 degrees. Cold enough to matter, not cold enough to kill a man of his conditioning in a few hours. Not quickly, anyway. Collier started working the case assuming a human perpetrator. That's always where you start. She canvassed every name on the AT shelter registries going back 2 weeks. She pulled trail camera footage from the National Forest Service. She interviewed every hiker who'd been in the corridor that week. One of them, a retired school teacher from Tennessee named Barbara Price, mentioned something she'd almost not included because she didn't want to sound like a cook. She'd been at a shelter about 6 miles south of where Hale's body was found 2 nights before. She'd woken up at around 2 a.m. and looked out the shelter opening because she'd heard something. She said what she saw was a figure standing in the tree line, roughly person-shaped and very tall. Taller than a person, she thought. Her word, assembled wrong. Like someone had built a human out of components that were slightly off-scale. It wasn't moving. She watched it for maybe 90 seconds. Then she pulled her bag over her head and lay still until morning. She hadn't filed a report because she didn't see it do anything, didn't think it qualified. Collier added it to the case file. Over the following 3 months, she found 4 more people who had been on or near that corridor of trail between February and April of 2009 described variants of the same thing. Tall, too thin, standing in tree lines at night, not moving for extended periods. None of them had connected their experience to the Hale case because none of them knew about the Hale case. Collier was the connecting node. The fifth interview was a man named Theodore Garris, who had been hiking that section of trail in March and had an encounter he described in considerably more detail than the others. He'd been camping alone, roughly 4 miles north of where Hale would later be found. He'd woken at 1 a.m. to silence, the absolute switch-thrown silence that every one of Collier's witnesses mentioned at some point, the silence where the insects stop. He'd unzipped his tent, turned on his headlamp, and swept it across the clearing. Nothing. He started to zip the tent closed, and then the headlamp caught something at the far edge of the clearing, at the tree line. A shape. Standing just inside the trees, partially obscured, but enough exposed that he could see it was upright. It was not a bear on hind legs. The proportions were wrong for that. Arms too long, shoulders too narrow, head too small in relation to the body's height. He estimated the height at between 8 and 9 feet. He didn't move. It didn't move. He said the thing that broke his nerve wasn't any movement from it. The thing that broke his nerve was realizing, while sitting there looking at it, that he'd been looking at it for 3 minutes before he noticed it. It had been there when he swept the headlamp across the clearing. He hadn't registered it because his brain had filed it as a tree. It wasn't a tree. He'd been sitting with his tent unzipped and the light on, fully visible, and it had been standing at his tree line for at minimum 3 minutes that he knew of, and God knows how long before. He shut off the headlamp and sat in the dark, and at some point he fell asleep, and when he woke up, it was morning, and he walked out and never went back. Collier's case file grew to 412 pages. It was never formally linked to any other case. The official cause of death was never revised. She retired in 2021. She kept a copy of the file, which is technically irregular, but nobody who knows her career well enough to question it. She did one interview, a podcast, 2022, where she said the following, and I'm going to put it plainly because she did. In 18 years, I never had a case I couldn't resolve to my satisfaction with a human perpetrator, an accident, or a natural cause. This one I couldn't. Whatever was in that corridor in the winter of 2009, I don't believe it was any of those three things. And I believe it's still there. Marcus Hale's family scattered his ashes on the AT, as he'd requested, in a section far north of Georgia. Nobody in the family hikes anymore. Nobody goes back to that trail in Rabun County. Not the rangers, not the researchers, not the volunteers who maintain that stretch. People say it's the weather, the terrain. People say all kinds of things. Collier says, it's still there, and the silence when it comes all at once, like a switch being thrown. That's the case she can't close. That's the one that keeps finding her. Subscribe if you want more of these. There's a whole trail's worth. Story 3, the last thing Ranger First Class Owen Briggs expected to find at the end of a routine welfare check was a man sitting cross-legged at the center of the trail, perfectly calm, perfectly dry, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with his eyes closed and his boots off and his bare feet pressing flat against the ground. Here's how that started. I've been a park ranger on the Appalachian Trail corridor for going on 14 years. I work out of a station in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, and my patrol zone covers about 60 miles of the AT plus several hundred acres of backcountry on either side. In 14 years, I've dealt with everything the trail throws at people: injuries, weather events, missing persons, wildlife encounters, search and rescue operations that went well and a few that didn't. I want to be clear before I get into this. I am not someone who believes in things I can't see and verify. My job is factual, methodical, evidence-based. I write incident reports in plain language, and I don't embellish. What I'm about to tell you is what I documented, what I observed, and what I still don't have good explanations for. The man on the trail during the thunderstorm, that was 2016. His name was Garrett. He told me when I tapped his shoulder and he opened his eyes. He wasn't distressed. His pupils responded normally. His pulse was fine. He could tell me the date and his home address. He'd been sitting there for 3 hours. He said, I was listening. I asked what he'd been listening to. He said, the sound it makes when it stands still. I didn't push him on that. People on the trail say strange things sometimes. I got him to his feet, verified he wasn't hypothermic, and walked him back to the trailhead where his partner was waiting. His partner said he'd just disappeared 3 hours earlier, with no warning, mid-conversation, walked off the trail into the trees. He had no memory of the 3 hours. Zero. He remembered saying something to his partner, and then he remembered me tapping his shoulder. I put it in my incident report as a possible dissociative episode and moved on. That's the version of these things I like. The one with a reasonable explanation that I can write down and file and not think about again. About half the strange encounters I've had out here resolve that way if I'm patient enough. The other half don't. Summer of 2018. I got a call from a volunteer trail crew, 3 guys doing maintenance on a section about 12 miles north of my station. They'd found a camp that they wanted me to look at. I drove out and hiked in to meet them. The camp was set in a clearing about 100 meters off the trail. It had been there for a while. The fire pit stones had that settled, weathered look of something used over many seasons, not just one. There was a rough, lean-to structure that somebody had built from lashed branches with considerable skill. The bedding inside was dry leaves over a frame of saplings, which is not how any hiker I've ever met sleeps, but would be functional. There was food stored in the lean-to, not camping food. Jarred goods, canned vegetables, dried meat, the kind of long-term storage food you'd find in a prepper pantry, a hand-crank radio, candles, a dozen of them, burned at various levels, a journal. I took the journal as evidence and photographed everything else. The journal was 46 pages of dense handwriting. I read it that evening. I'm not going to go into all of it. Some of it was clearly the writing of someone whose mental state had deteriorated significantly. But there were recurring themes that I logged. The writer referred to something they called the Watchers. They described them as tall, thin, and stationary. Present at the tree line at night, not aggressive, never aggressive, just watching. The writer had apparently been living at this camp for at least 2 winters and had become, over that time, entirely comfortable with the Watchers. Toward the end of the journal, the tone shifted from fear to something closer to accommodation. They don't want anything, one entry read. They've been here longer than the trail, longer than us. They're just watching to see what we do. We never identified the writer. No missing persons report matched the camp's apparent occupation period. No forensic hits on the surfaces. The lean-to is still there, as far as I know. We cleared the food and documented it, and left the structure. I checked that clearing for the next 3 years on my regular rounds. The candles were always different, shorter than before, or replaced with new ones. Never more than a few days burned. Somebody was still using that camp. I never saw who. Winter of 2020, I had an encounter I still don't talk about in official contexts, but I'll tell you here because I think it matters. I was doing a night check, unusual, but we'd had some trail closures due to ice conditions and I wanted to verify signage. It was about 1 a.m., temperature around 20 degrees. Clear sky, good moon, enough light to move without a headlamp. I was coming around a switchback on the ridge when I stopped. There was something on the trail ahead of me, roughly 40 meters, upright, standing in the middle of the trail facing away from me. My first thought, hiker. Stupid night hiker, no lights, probably lost. I'm a professional. I handle this. I said, Park Service, don't be alarmed. Can I get you to turn around for me? It didn't move. I put my hand on my radio and clicked the side twice, my check-in signal with dispatch, and kept my eyes on the shape. It was not right. I say that knowing how it sounds. The height was wrong, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were too narrow and too high, like they were pulled up toward the ears. The arms, I could see the arms in the moonlight, hanging at the sides, were too long. The hands hung nearly to the knee. It was standing so still that for a moment I convinced myself it was a signpost I'd misidentified in the dark. But signposts don't cast the kind of shadow this was casting. It was 3-dimensional. It breathed. I could see in the cold air the faint movement of its breath. I said, Sir, I need you to identify yourself, and turn to face me. It turned. I have never, in 14 years of this work, run from anything on this trail. I've held my ground in front of black bears. I've talked down unstable people at cliff edges. I have a protocol for every situation. I did not hold my ground. I moved backward, and then I turned and I walked fast, and I didn't look back, and I got to my truck and I sat in it for 45 minutes with the engine running and the doors locked. I filed an incident report that said I encountered an unidentified individual on the trail and was unable to make contact. That's not entirely false. I haven't done a night check alone since. The trail is 14 years of my career. I know it like I know my own house. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. Whatever is standing in those tree lines at night, it doesn't belong there. But it's been there a long time. And based on that journal, it was there long before any of us arrived. Stay subscribed. These stories don't stop at 14 years. Story 4. The last thing Pete Callahan expected on his final day of work was to see the tracks again. The same tracks he'd seen on his first day, 31 years ago, when his old supervisor had looked at them and said simply, "Don't follow those." Here's where it all started. People ask me what it's like to retire from ski patrol after 31 years. I tell them it's like waking up from a long dream. Not a bad dream, a real one. The kind where the cold is actual cold and the snow has weight and the dark above the tree line is a specific dark you don't find anywhere else. I started at Appalachian Slopes Mountain Resort in 1993. I was 22 years old and thought the mountain was a problem I could master. 31 years later, I know better. The mountain doesn't get mastered. You just learn, over time, which parts of it to stop asking questions about. I'm going to tell you about those parts. The first winter, February. Training week was over and I was doing solo patrol circuits on the North Face, which in those days was a lot less developed than it is now. Fewer lights, fewer runs, more forest pushing in close to the edges. My supervisor, A man named Dolph, who'd been doing this since the late 1970s, had walked the first circuit with me and handed me off at the top of the North Run with the usual instructions. Then he paused and said, "The tree line on the left side where the run curves, don't go in there." I asked why. He thought about it for a moment and said, "You'll see why if you look long enough." Don't look too long. He skied off and left me with that. I did my circuit. I came around the curve on the North Run and I looked at the tree line on the left the way you look at something you've been told not to think about. There was a figure in the trees, tall, standing between two pines, partially obscured, facing the run, facing me. I skied past without stop. When I looked back, it was gone. I told myself it was a skier who'd gone off trail into the trees to relieve himself. This is plausible, and it happens. I believed it, and I didn't mention it to Dolph. 3 weeks later, same circuit, same spot, different figure, same general size, same position. Between two trees, just inside the forest, facing out. I slowed down this time. I stopped and looked. It looked back. I could see the outline clearly enough against the snow and the tree shadow. Upright, approximately 7 feet tall, arms too long for the body. It didn't move. I didn't move. The cold at that elevation gets into your thinking, makes everything very simple and very immediate. I was standing on a ski run at 11 p.m. in 20-degree weather looking at something I couldn't identify, and the cold was telling me to make a decision. I skied away. The next morning, I told Dolph. He listened. He nodded. "Yeah, they watch the runs at night." I asked, "What are they?" He said, "I don't know. I've been here since '79. They were here when I started. Davey, who trained me, said they were here when he started, and that was '71. He poured coffee and looked at me and said, "Nobody's been hurt. Not by them. You don't go into the trees at night. They don't come out of the trees. That's the deal." I asked if he'd ever told management. He laughed. Not unkindly. "Tell them what?" he said. "We don't know what they are. We can't photograph them. I've tried. They're not doing anything wrong. They're just watching." I spent 31 years on that mountain. I saw them, at minimum, 100 times. In the trees on the North Face Run. In the bowl at the back of the intermediate trails when the lights shut off at 10 p.m. and the mountain went dark. Twice, and this is the part I hesitate to tell because I know how it sounds, twice I saw one in full open space, not in the trees. Standing in the middle of an unlit ski run in the dark, 100 meters out, just standing. Both times I stopped. Both times it was gone by the time I skied closer. They never came out when guests were on the mountain. Every sighting I'm aware of, over 31 years of comparing notes with long-term patrol staff, was late night, early morning, or post-close. Like they waited. Like they knew the schedule. We had a rule, informal, passed down from Dolph and probably from Davey before him. New patrol hires got told in their first week, casually and without drama. Don't go into the tree line on the North Face at night. Don't be alone in the bowl after close. Don't shine your light into the trees and wait. Nobody asked too many questions. The mountain was good work. The pay was decent. The thing about working the same piece of land for 30 years is that you develop a kind of truce with the things you can't explain. You give them their space, they give you yours. My last day was this past December. I did my final circuit alone, the way I'd done the first 131 years earlier. North Face, down the curved run past the tree line. I stopped at the spot, looked into the trees. One of them was there, same as always. Between the pines, tall too thin, arms too long, facing me. I stood there for a minute. I don't know why. Some kind of goodbye, maybe. Acknowledging that we'd shared this mountain for 3 decades, and it had never hurt me, and I'd never intruded on it. Then I skied down. At the base of the run, in the snow just past the last lift tower, there were tracks. Bipedal. Evenly spaced. No boot pattern. Just a smooth, deep impression, like a bare foot, but too large and too narrow. They came from the direction of the tree line. They ended at the edge of the groomed snow. Something had walked out, stopped there, and gone back. I stood and looked at them for a while. Then I took off my skis and handed in my badge and drove home. I've been retired for 3 months. My wife says I seem lighter. I am. But I also find myself, at night, sitting near the window, looking at the tree line at the edge of our yard. Just to check. Just to make sure nothing is looking back. Subscribe. There are 31 years of stories. We've barely started. Story 5. The last thing Ellen Marsh saw before she lost her footing on the ridge trail was a shape between the trees that was wrong in a way her brain couldn't immediately name, and then the ground shifted and she was falling. And when she stopped falling and looked up, it was gone. Here's what she knows about what she saw. There's a word people in certain parts of Appalachia use when they talk about these things. Not outsiders. Outsiders have their own words, most of them borrowed from other traditions, none of them quite right. But people who grew up in the hollows and on the ridges and in the small mountain communities that have been here since before the trail was cut, they have a word, and the word is stretched. As in, something that used to be regular and got pulled too long. As in, something that's close to human, but didn't stop where it was supposed to. I grew up in McDowell County, West Virginia. My grandmother used the word. Her grandmother used it before her. You didn't talk about the stretched people in certain places. You didn't call them out by name. You didn't discuss them in the hours after dark in the woods, because words carry, and what carries words can be listening. But you knew about them. Every family in the hollow knew about them. Every person who had spent significant time in the deep forest, above the elevation where the farms stop and the trees get tight and the light goes strange in the afternoon, they had a story or they knew someone who did. I'm going to tell you some of those stories. My grandmother's was the first I heard. She was a girl, 9 or 10 years old, running an errand for her father at dusk. A shortcut through the woods between two farms, she'd done it 100 times. She knew every tree. Halfway through, she stopped. Something was standing in the path ahead of her. She described it. Like a man, but taller, much taller. Thin the way a shadow is thin when the sun is low and pulling it long across the ground. The arms were wrong, hanging too far, reaching almost to the knees. The head was small for the body, slightly to one side. It was looking at her. She said she did not run. She said running felt like the wrong thing, though she couldn't have told you why. She turned around, slowly, she was very specific about the slowly, and walked back the way she'd come without looking back. When she reached her father's farm, she turned and looked at the path. It was standing at the tree line. Still watching, her grandmother, when she told her what happened, didn't react with alarm. She said, "You did the right thing. Don't run from them. Don't look at them too long. Don't go back that way for a few days." Then she made tea and changed the subject, and that was the entire guidance. This is consistent with everything I've been told. The Appalachian folklore around these things is remarkably stable across different families in different counties who've never spoken to each other about it. They don't attack, they watch. They seem drawn to people who are alone, particularly at dusk and after dark and before dawn. They don't follow you out of the woods, or they didn't used to. A man I spoke to in Raleigh County described an encounter from the late 1990s. He was deer hunting solo in the pre-dawn hours. He'd been hunting this ridge for 20 years and knew it perfectly. He set up in his usual stand and waited for light. Around 5 a.m., before full dawn, he became aware of something standing about 30 meters to his left between two hemlocks. He looked at it. Too tall, too thin, arms at the wrong length. Standing completely still, facing him, he said the thing that disturbed him most was not the figure itself, but his own reaction to it. He felt, in his words, turned down, like a dial being reduced. He said his heart rate slowed, his thoughts slowed. He sat in stand and looked at it, and it looked at him, and time moved differently for a while. He couldn't tell you if it was 20 minutes or 2 hours. Eventually it was gone and the light was coming up. When he climbed down from the stand, his watch showed 8:47 a.m. He couldn't account for 3 hours. He went home. He didn't hunt that ridge again. He sold the property 2 years later. 3 accounts from different women I spoke to in Nicholas County independently described the same behavior. The stretched person would stand and watch, and after a period of time varied anywhere from minutes to hours. It would simply be somewhere else without any apparent motion. No walking away, no movement. There, and then not there. One of the women, a retired school teacher, said, "It doesn't move like something moves. It's there, and then it's decided to be somewhere else." There is a consistency to the height across accounts that is striking. Almost everyone describes them at somewhere between 7 and 9 feet. Everyone describes the arms. Everyone describes the stillness. Nobody, not in my grandmother's account, not in anything I've been told firsthand, not in any account I've collected over 15 years of talking to people in these counties, has described one of them doing anything. They stand, they watch, they leave. Whatever they are, the mountains have been keeping them for a long time. My grandmother lived to 94. In her last year in the nursing home, she sometimes woke up at night and said there was someone in the corner of her room, tall, just watching. The nurses assumed she was confused. I'm not sure she was. I think some things follow you farther than the tree line. I think the mountains let you leave, but they keep something of what they showed you. And sometimes, in the thin hours of the morning, that something stands in the corner and watches and doesn't say a word. Subscribe. There are more of these stories than I can count. Story 6, the last thing I saw before I ran, was its hand, if you can call it that, reaching around the side of a tree trunk, not holding it, not gripping it, just resting there, palm flat, against the bark, fingers too long and too widely spaced, completely still. Here's how I ended up standing 12 feet away from it. I want to tell you up front that I'm not a dramatic person. I work in insurance. I coach Little League on Saturdays. I've been married for 11 years, and the most adventurous thing I usually do is try a new restaurant. I don't exaggerate things, and I don't have a history of seeing things that aren't there. On the third weekend of September last year, my college friend Brack and I took a 3-day hiking trip into rural Appalachia in eastern Kentucky. We'd both been saying for years that we were going to do something like this. Kids came and went, careers got busy, and then Brack's marriage ended, and he needed to get out of the city, and I said I'd go with him. We picked a trail system that wasn't heavily trafficked. I'd rather not give the specific name of the trail for reasons I'll get to, and drove out Friday afternoon. The first day was perfect, the way good hiking is perfect. Your body starts complaining and then stops, and then you hit a rhythm where the pack disappears and you're just moving through the world, through the light and the smell and the sound of things you don't normally get to hear. We made camp at a creek crossing about 7 miles in. Made dinner, talked until the fire got low, slept well Saturday. We pushed up to a ridge that gave us a view of 3 counties, ate lunch at the top. Brack seemed better, lighter than he'd been in months. We talked about coming back in the spring and doing the full loop. It was on the way down that I first noticed it. We were descending a switchback section through dense forest, the kind where the canopy closes overhead and the light goes green and filtered. I was maybe 20 feet ahead of Brack, moving a little faster. I came around a curve and stopped. There was something standing in the forest to my left, about 50 feet off the trail, in the shadows under the canopy, standing very still. My first thought was, person, someone else on the trail. Then I looked more carefully. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. The arms, I could see both arms hanging at its sides, and they fell past where arms should end, down toward knee level, maybe below. The head seemed small. It was wearing, or it appeared to be wearing, something dark. I stood there and looked at it. It did not look at me. Its face, whatever it was turned slightly away. Looking at something else, or not looking at anything. Brack came around the curve and nearly walked into me. I grabbed his arm, pointed. Mouth. He looked. I watched his face go through the same sequence mine had gone through. Recognition, wrongness, something tightening around the eyes. We stood there for probably 30 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in the middle of a trail looking at something in the forest. Didn't move. We moved, slowly, quietly, keeping our eyes on it until the trail curved again and the trees blocked our line of sight. We didn't talk about it for maybe 15 minutes. The way you don't talk about something while part of your brain is still processing whether it was real. Then Brack said, "What was that?" Not a question, a statement, the kind of statement you make when you know there's no good answer. I told him what I'd seen, he confirmed what he'd seen, and we concluded it was either a very tall person doing something very unusual or it was something we had no category for. We made camp that night and didn't build a fire. At about 2 a.m. I woke up, full alert, no drowsiness. The kind of waking that means something woke you. I lay still and listened. Silence. The complete switched-off silence I now know means something. Then, from the right side of the tent, close, maybe 8 feet, a sound. Low, not an animal sound, not exactly. More like pressure released through a very small opening. Rhythmic. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. Breathing. Something standing next to my tent in the dark. Breathing. I did not make a sound. I did not reach for my light. I lay completely still and listened to whatever was outside breathe for, I think, about 45 minutes. Then silence again. Real silence. Insects coming back. In the morning I found the area on the right side of the tent where the leaves were compacted in an ovoid shape, roughly the size and shape of something that had been standing there for a long time. We broke camp in 20 minutes and walked out. 12 miles, more than 4.5 hours. We didn't stop. On the way back to the car, we passed the section of trail where we'd seen it the afternoon before I looked. There was nothing there. But the tree at the spot where it had been standing, a large oak, I'd noticed it the day before, had something on it, about 7 feet up on the side facing the trail. A handprint, or something shaped like one. The bark pressed smooth in the shape of a very large, very long-fingered hand. I don't know when it got there. I don't know if it had always been there and I hadn't noticed. I didn't stop to look at it long. I've driven past the turnoff for that trail 3 times since September. Each time I keep going. I don't know what I saw. I know what I saw. Those aren't contradictory statements. That's just what it's like to see something that doesn't fit into the world you thought you were living in. Subscribe if you've had something similar. You're not alone. The comments on these videos make that very clear. Story 7. The last thing I expected to hear from inside a house I'd owned for 6 years, in a room I knew was empty, was the sound of something sitting down. Here's what that house was. My wife and I bought it in 2011. Farmhouse, circa 1890, about 12 acres on a mountain in Smith County, Virginia, southwestern corner of the state, right in the fold of the Appalachians. We were young and romantic about it. The porch, the mountain view, the way the fog moved through the valley in the mornings. We lived there full-time for 2 years, and then when work moved us to Roanoke, we kept it as a weekend place. 7 years total. We sold it in 2018 and have not been back since. I want to say that we loved that house, genuinely. I'm not one of these people with a ghost story who says the house was always wrong. The house was right. The house was beautiful. What happened there was not the house's fault. I'll start with the sounds because that's how everything starts. Year 1, late winter. My wife and I were both awake at 3 a.m. Unusual but not alarming, could be the wind, the settling of old boards. We lay in the dark and listened. Footsteps in the hallway. Old houses have sounds. I'd lived in 3 old houses before this one. I know what the creak of settling wood sounds like, what the expansion and contraction of floorboards sounds like. This was different. These were even, spaced, deliberate. The pattern of something walking. They moved down the hallway past our door and stopped. Silence. Then, from the room at the end of the hall, the room we used as an office, the sound of something sitting down. The specific sound. A shift of weight. A compression, a settling. My wife and I looked at each other in the dark. Neither of us went to check. In the morning, the office was exactly as we'd left it. Nothing moved, nothing displaced. We talked about it matter-of-factly over breakfast, the way you talk about things you've decided not to be afraid of. Old house, weird sounds. We moved on. It happened again 6 weeks later. Same sequence. Footsteps, hallway, office, sitting. We were awake both times, and both times we heard it together. 2 separate people hearing the same thing rules out dreaming. Year 2, summer. Our neighbor, a man in his 70s who'd farmed the next property for his entire life, came over to help me with a section of fence. We were out on the back edge of the property near the tree line, and he stopped and looked at the tree line for a moment. Then he said, without any, what's out there. I didn't know how to answer that. He said, my father saw them. His father before that. They don't cause trouble. They just watch. He went back to the fence. I asked him later over coffee what he'd meant. He said, tall things. In the trees. At night, nobody knows what they are. They've always been here. He shrugged. You see them? I said, not exactly. But something was in our house at night. He thought about that. Might be different, he said. Might be the same. Some of the old teamers thought they came inside sometimes, in winter especially. Looking for warmth or looking for something else. He was quiet. Then, I'd put salt on the windowsills. Old habit. I thanked him. I put salt on the windowsills. The footsteps stopped for most of the next year. The thing in the 3rd year, this is what I didn't tell my wife until we'd already sold the house, because I didn't want to be the reason we left somewhere we loved, was what I saw in the window. I was coming back from the barn late one evening. Full dark. November. I had a flashlight, but I was mostly navigating by memory because I'd done the walk 1,000 times. I looked up at the back of the house. There was a shape in the window of the office, on the inside of the glass, looking out. Too tall for the window. It was crouched or bent or folded in some way that allowed it to fit the frame. Long arms folded in front of it, head tilted to see out. It was looking at me. I stood in the yard and it sat in my window and we looked at each other for, I think, about 10 seconds. Then it was gone, between one blink and the next, like a channel changing. I went inside. I went to the office. Nothing there. Nothing moved. Nothing wrong. The salt on the windowsill of the office had been disturbed, pushed to the edges. The center of the sill was clean. I reset the salt. I didn't tell my wife. We had 2 more years in that house without significant incident. I won't say nothing happened. The footsteps came back occasionally. The sitting sound in the office maybe 4 or 5 more times. Once, in our last winter there, I heard something on the porch roof. Not a raccoon, not a squirrel. The specific sound of weight, evenly distributed, moving slowly. I didn't check. The people who bought the house are a family with 3 children. I've thought about them a great deal. I don't know what to say to them, or how to say it, that wouldn't sound like the invention of a seller trying to void a contract. I left the salt on the windowsills. I hope they left it there. I hope whatever was in that house respects it. I missed the porch. I missed the morning fog in the valley. I missed 12 acres and a mountain view. I don't miss the sound of something sitting down in the empty room at the end of the hall. Subscribe. There's one more story from that house I haven't told yet. I'll get to it. Story 8, the last thing Tommy Hess heard before trail disappeared in the dark ahead of him was footsteps. Not his own, not from behind, but from the dark in front of him, moving toward him. Here's why Tommy was on the trail at 11 p.m. Don't hike the Appalachian Trail at night. I know that sounds simple. I know it sounds like advice you'd read on a laminated sign at a trailhead and ignore. But I'm telling you this from the other side of what happens when you don't follow it. And I need you to understand I'm not being dramatic. I'm being exact. Tommy Hess was 23. He was hiking a section in North Carolina with 2 friends, both of whom had bailed the previous day, one with a turned ankle, one who just got tired and wanted a bed. Tommy had cell service at the last shelter and called his girlfriend and told her he was going to push through to the next town, get a motel, have a real meal. She told him to wait until morning. He didn't wait. He started at 9 p.m. with his headlamp and a good pace and a trail he'd been on for 6 days and thought he knew. Here's what nobody tells you about a trail you've hiked in daylight. At night, it becomes a different thing. The reference points you use to orient yourself, a bent tree, a rock formation, a fork with a distinctive view, disappear in the dark. What you're left with is a corridor of light from your headlamp and darkness on all sides. Tommy's first hour was fine. He was moving fast, trail was clear, weather was good. The second hour, the weather changed. Cloud cover rolled in, the air temperature dropped. He stopped to add a layer, and when he got moving again, the rhythm was off. He knew it, but he was already past the point where going back made sense. At 11:13 p.m. by his phone, his headlamp battery began to fail. He didn't have spares. He had his phone's flashlight, which gave him maybe 4 hours of battery total if he was careful. He switched to it, turned the beam wide, and kept moving. And that's when he heard the footsteps, ahead of him on the trail, coming toward him. The rhythm of someone walking, his first thought was, another hiker. Night hikers exist. It's unusual and not particularly wise, but it happens. He stopped. Called out, hello? Trail hiker coming through. The footsteps stopped. He waited. Nothing. He called out again. Nothing. He started walking. The footsteps started again, still ahead of him. Still moving toward him. He stopped again. They stopped again. He stood in the middle of the trail in the dark with his phone light in his hand and the night pressing in on all sides, and whatever was ahead of him, between him and the town, stopped walking every time he stopped. He made a decision. He was going to push through. He started moving. The footsteps ahead of him started moving, but this time they were moving in the same direction he was. Away from him now, leading him. He pushed harder. The footsteps stayed just ahead. Same speed, same rhythm, matching him exactly. He slowed. They slowed. He ran. They ran. He made it about 200 meters before he went off the trail edge in the dark and hit the down slope and rolled 8 feet into a tree. He lay there. He could hear them on the trail above him. Stopped, waiting. He turned off his phone light. Complete darkness. Complete silence. He lay against the tree and did not move for what he estimates was over an hour. When he turned the phone light back on, he climbed back up to the trail. Nothing. Nobody. He walked the remaining 3 miles to town in the dark without his light. He'd cracked the screen in the fall and the flashlight was gone. He navigated by feel, by the trail surface under his boots. Whatever had been on the trail didn't follow him. He got to the motel at 3 a.m. and didn't sleep. Here's what I know about the Appalachian Trail at night from the people I've spoken to, the accounts I've read, the patterns I've found. It is not just an elevated risk of falls, exposure, and disorientation. Those things are real, but they're secondary. The primary risk is simpler. You are in someone else's territory, in the dark, and you cannot see who's watching. Everything that exists in those mountains has adapted to the dark. The deer, the bears, the things that don't have names. They know the terrain under their feet without light. They can track by sound and smell and whatever other senses they have that you don't. You have a phone light with 4 hours of battery and a trail you can only see 5 feet ahead. The trail is their home. At night, you are a visitor who showed up uninvited. Most of the time they let you pass. Most of the time. Tommy Hess got out. He drove home the next day. He's fine. He doesn't hike at night. Nobody who's heard his story does. Subscribe and stay on the trail in the daylight. I'll have another story ready in the dark. Story 9. The last thing I expected to say at 53 years old was that I saw something last weekend that I cannot explain and that I'm a little bit afraid to talk about, but here I am. Here's who I am first so you understand what it means when I say I cannot explain it. I was born in Mingo County. Grew up in Wayne County. I have lived within 30 miles of the same mountain ridge my entire life. I know this landscape the way you know a language you grew up speaking, not just the words, but the rhythm, the texture, the things underneath the words that can't be translated. I am 53 years old. I've spent most of my adult life outdoors, hunting, fishing, working on my family's property, cutting trail on weekends when I help with volunteer maintenance work. I've been in these mountains in every season, in every weather condition, at every hour of the day and night. I am not someone who startles. I am not someone who imagines things. My kids will tell you I'm the most boring, steady person they know. Last Saturday night, I saw something I cannot explain and I need to put it somewhere, so I'm putting it here. My cousin Dale and I had been working on a section of fence line at the back of our family's property all day. Back 40 acres, heavily forested, butts up against the ridge that connects to the national forest. We'd been out there since 8 a.m. and we worked later than planned because we wanted to finish the section. By the time we packed up, it was close to 9 p.m. We were walking back through the property along the tree line when Dale stopped. He put his hand on my arm. I stopped. I looked where he was looking, into the tree line about 40 meters in. Dark in there. The moon was up, but not through the canopy. I didn't see anything. I started to say so. He tightened his grip on my arm. Then I saw it. Movement. But not movement. That's not right. Let me try again. There was something there that hadn't been there before. Between 2 large oaks. Upright, very tall. I've seen bears on hind legs. This was not a bear on hind legs. The proportions were wrong in a way I can't describe precisely, but could not mistake. The arms were the thing. Too long. Resting at the sides of a body that was too thin for its height. It was looking at us. I've been looked at by animals my whole life. Deer, coyotes, bobcats once, a bear once. Every animal has a different look. There's something in the eyes, the calculation, the category they put you in. Predator or prey or irrelevant, this thing was looking at us like we were familiar. Not threatening, not interesting, exactly. Familiar. Like it had seen us before, like it had been watching us all day and we were finally looking back. Dale and I stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then I said quietly, "Let's go." We walked back to the house. Not running, walking. We went inside and Dale poured 2 glasses of bourbon and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. Then Dale said, "I saw something like that when I was 12. Back in the same tree line, I never told anybody." I asked him why. He said, "Because what do you tell people? I saw something tall in the woods. Nobody wants to hear that." We drank the bourbon. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. That look. The look that wasn't predator, wasn't prey, wasn't curiosity. Recognition. It looked at me like it knew me. Not me specifically. Not my face. But person. Of this place, on this land, which is also its land. I've been here 53 years. Whatever that was, I think it's been here longer. I don't know what it is. I've heard the old names, the things people in these counties call them. My grandfather had words for things in these mountains that weren't quite people and weren't quite animals. He said them very casually, the way you mention any neighbor. Maybe that's what this is. A neighbor. A neighbor who's been here since before there were fences. I went back out Monday morning and looked at the tree line in the daylight. Between those 2 oaks, the ground was compacted, the way ground compacts when something stands in the same spot repeatedly. Not one night. Many nights. It's been standing there a long time. Looking at the house. Looking at us. I don't know if I should be afraid of that. I'm not sure I am. But I'm not sure I'm not. Subscribe. I've got 53 years of this land, and I'm only beginning to understand what's been sharing it with us. Story 10. The last thing Kara remembered before the torches crested the ridge behind them was that she had no idea how far the river was, or whether it was deep enough to cross, or whether whatever was on the other side would be better than what was behind them. Here's how Kara and her boyfriend Michael ended up running through the dark in the mountains of West Virginia. This happened in August, 3 years ago. Kara has told me this story twice. The first time was right after it happened, and she was shaking. The second time was last spring over coffee, and she was calm and organized about it in a way that sometimes happens when you've told something enough times that it stops fully belonging to you. Both tellings matched. I asked her specifically about that. She said, "I've checked. I'm not exaggerating it. If anything, I've simplified it because some parts I still don't like thinking about." She and Michael were 4 days into a 2-week trip along a stretch of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia, heading north. They were experienced hikers, not ultramarathon level, but solid, well-prepared, sensible about risk. They'd made camp on the 3rd night at a site near a ridge with a good view. Beautiful spot. They'd watched the stars and gone to sleep. It was the sounds that woke Kara first, or something that was serving the function of drums, a deep, rhythmic, organic percussion coming from somewhere on the ridge above them. Hollow, resonant, regular. Michael was already awake. They lay in the tent and listened. The drumming continued. It didn't stop. It wasn't an animal sound. It was structured, deliberately rhythmic, obviously produced by something that understood repetition and pattern. Then the voices. Low chanting, with a quality Kara described as her word deliberate. Not singing, not speaking, something between. She said it was multiple voices, but unified. All doing the same thing at the same time. They were about half a mile up the ridge. Kara and Michael made the decision to get out of the tent and look. This is the decision I'd argue with if I were them, and I've told Kara this. She agrees, but she also says the sounds were so structured, so clearly human, that her fear response didn't engage the way it would have for a bear or something unknown. Her brain filed it as people doing something strange. Weird but human. So they unzipped the tent, they climbed the ridge, they found a clearing they hadn't seen in the daylight, a wide, flat area above the tree line, rocky and open to the sky, and in the clearing, gathered around a fire that was larger than a camping fire had any right to be, were people. Kara estimates 15 to 20. She's careful about the number because the firelight made counting difficult, and she was scared enough by that point that her count might be off. They were wearing robes. Not Halloween robes, she's specific about this. Actual robes, well-made, dark, and they were arranged in a rough circle around the fire, with someone at the head of the circle who was taller than the others, in front of what appeared to be a symbol or emblem she couldn't make out from the distance. The chanting had stopped when they reached the clearing's edge. There was a moment, she said it was maybe 2 or 3 seconds, where she was not sure she'd been seen. Then the tall figure at the head of the circle turned and looked directly at her. She grabbed Michael's arm and they ran. She doesn't say she knew for certain she was in danger, She says she made a decision in 2 seconds based on everything she was seeing and everything she felt in and her body said, go. They ran back down the ridge and passed their camp without stopping. They grabbed their packs, and this is the training kicking in. You grab the pack or you have nothing, and they kept moving. Behind them, on the ridge, the chanting had resumed, louder now, and then torches. Over the crest of the ridge behind them, 2, 4, 6, moving fast. They were being followed. Kara doesn't allow herself to think about whether they were actually being chased or whether the torches were coincidental. She says, I know what it looked like. I ran. They ran for 40 minutes through forest in the dark with phone lights, no trail, heading toward what Kara thought was a valley road she'd seen on the map. The torches were behind them for most of that time. Then they weren't. They reached the road, a county road, empty, no markings they recognized. They walked along it for over an hour before headlights came and a pickup truck, a couple in their 60s, coming back from a late trip to town, stopped and gave them a ride to the nearest gas station. Kara called the police from the gas station. 2 deputies came. They were polite, took notes, asked for location. Said they'd check it out. Kara got a call 3 days later. The deputies had hiked to where they thought the clearing was. They found a fire ring. No robes, no people, no evidence of any gathering. The fire ring, the deputy noted on the phone, looked like it gets regular use. Kara asked what that meant. He said old ash layers. Looks like they've been meeting there a while. He didn't follow up. She didn't call back. Michael doesn't talk about it. He and Kara are still together, and he's made a rule. No more overnight hiking, no more trail camping, no more mountains after dark. Kara respects it because she doesn't want to go back either. But here's the thing she came back to. Both times she told me this story. The thing she can't file away. When the tall figure at the head of the circle turned and looked at her, in those 2 or 3 seconds before she ran, she had the very specific, very clear impression that whoever it was not surprised to see them. Was not alarmed, not angry, not disturbed, was expecting them. Like she and Michael hadn't stumbled onto something, like they'd been led there. She thinks about the night before a lot. How easy the camping site had been to find, how perfect the view. How neither of them had felt any unease on the approach. How the ridge above had seemed in daylight like nothing more than a ridge. She says, I don't know if we were followed to that camp from the trail, or if we'd been watched for longer than that. I don't know when it started. She pauses. I just know that when he looked at me, it wasn't like seeing a stranger. There are more stories from the dark. The mountains have been keeping them for a long time.